Welcome to Contrasense, a podcast exploring current issues and new research from the social sciences. I'm Pati and together with my colleague Maria Martelli, we'll be talking about education, globalization in a particular context, such as South Korea, and especially the educational system. But first, I think me and Maria are going to have like a short discussion about general education, I think.
Well, the thing is that I thought also because it's summer and we should all be a little bit more relaxed, that it would be nice to really start going on with what happens right now in the Romanian context. Because our episode is basically about globalization and how it manifests in South Korea. And this is going to be with our guest, George Baca. He's going to tell us about his research on that, but the whole thing that we read, I mean, it made me think of the Romanian Bacalaureate that's happening right now. I thought it's just important to maybe touch upon that a little bit.
Yeah, please do.
Well, I mean, I'm not like such a big expert on the Baccalaureate, but like my field of interest is also education. And well, when I was in second year, I remember that I did this tiny research project on the Baccalaureate, and what I was looking at was how this shapes the lives of students. So this is like for those who do not know, this is the Romanian last exam. When you finish the high school, you do this big exam that it is actually in more disciplines depending on your profile. So you could do it in Romanian, maths, and maybe geography or history or something like that. If you're on the maths profile, I think.
On the social science, you can choose between geography or like a social thing like psychology, sociology, or history.
Yeah. I didn't do maths because I was philology, but I just what I found was really important at the moment was that this test was defining much more of learning than it should have, I think, because it became this like big standard that people were supposed to direct all learning towards, and learning was not directed towards, I don't know, learning itself as maybe it could be, but it was very like they say, teaching to the test, and this high stakes testing thing does this fact that you end up learning how to answer questions. Multiple choice questions even instead of learning things in themselves.
Yeah, I was thinking that this was really interesting because for me, especially in high school, it was this frustration that it was always, why do we choose this kind of answer? And the answer from my colleagues were like, well, that's what the professor said, so we have to do it. So I think that's a common thing that happens in the high school in Romania, especially, like you have to learn these kind of skills to actually progress, but not actually learn stuff too much, just to memorize in order to pass.
Yeah, I mean, I was amazed how much of it is performance and how much of it is what you learned actually is that you learn how to pass the test. You didn't learn the thing, you learned the test.
A shortcut into the main thing, yeah.
The other day when I was researching this, I started looking at some of the baccalaureate subjects, and I checked sociology, of course. And the questions, they were so, I don't know, I didn't research, there's no real research here. I didn't research who writes these questions, but they
were great.
I will give you one example.
Yes, please do.
So they had this question that says, like, it's a multiple choice question. And it says, the purpose of a political party is A, to be unpopular amongst voters. B, to win elections alone or in coalition with other parties. C, to be outlawed for fraud or corruption. And D, to refuse political power.
Who would do that?
I don't know. I sincerely do not know how it ended up that, I don't know, maybe knowing sociology at the high school level is defined like knowing the answer to this question.
Yeah, it's really complicated.
I think like when learning to the test stuff, it's really useful to go back to like Marilyn Stratton's quote. It's like this very famous quote that says, when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. Like it's not a measure anymore at this point. It is the target. In that sense, I would just maybe like add like to add, because when the baccalaureate is coming, it's kind of all over the news, like this exam of maturity that students need to undertake, and
and you suddenly become an adult. You just pass the baccalaureate and poof, you're an adult.
And it takes such a big toll on some of the students' mental health, I think, and their image of themselves, and it's just worrying, extremely worrying that it is like that.
Yeah, I think you did like a really great introduction for our discussion today, and I also thought that when I read George Baca's paper, I thought that I kind of had this kind of information about the Korean or Japanese education, because I used to watch a lot of animes, read mangas and manhwas, and watch a lot of Korean soap operas. So most of them that I was watching were like the main protagonist always was a student who was struggling to have like a social life, have good grades, and also they were in a more poor family, so they had to take a job in order to get a tutor, to have lessons and get good grades. And I think this is like a short glimpse that I can get from the educational system, where those kind of competitiveness and having good grades, it's actually like more important than learning the actual information and starting to learn new things that can help you along the way. So in this case, we will see along the episode, you kind of became like this human resource that can be great for the market later when you finish the school and go and work in some corporation. And
the thing that's depressing is that in some sense, it's still not clear for many people that this is bad. This is just has a bad impact on people and their lives, like just being turned into resources for profit making.
Yeah.
Of course, now if you put it in this language, it sounds like it sounds bad. But the language that is usually put in is that like this is development. You're becoming capable. You're becoming. You can become independent economically. Like independent of whom?
Exactly.
I don't know.
Yeah, you can have like a great career and start a new job and a new life and open your maybe a business or something if you're lucky enough.
This new life thing, I think it's also striking, because also George Baca touches a bit upon this ritualic process of like doing these exams. But this new life thing is it's a thing, because I remember when I was interviewing students regarding their high school experiences, some of them used to say, "Well, I just want this to be over and life to start."
Yeah,
like, this is
exactly.
not real life. This is not real life. How did we end up designing a system of learning that's not real life?
Yeah, and actually harms us very, very much, especially in this kind of context where you have to compete and have greater grades, and these whole mental issues are are not discussed like with students or professors. And I remember when I was when I had the baccalaureate kind of thing going, I was kind of depressed, and when I was asked like, what do you want to do further, I was actually responding the same, like, I just want to finish this and then focus on myself and be better, because I was going to such a stressful situation, and all I wanted was to end it and just go along.
Oh, I remember, this made me remember one of my interviewee who said, she said something like that after the baccalaureate, she just didn't know what else now. She just focused so much on doing that, so much on, fulfilling that expectations of having high grades at the baccalaureate, that afterwards she was just like, but I don't know how daily life should look like now when I don't have to like learn every day for many hours. It's just, I mean, what I want to say is that I just hope everybody who's doing the baccalaureate right now is not stressing too much. And then everybody, the students, but also the teachers, that they're, I don't know, maybe kind with it and a bit like distrustful of it. And I know I see it's really hard to design good systems for everybody. Of course, it's impossible, but improvements can be made.
Yes, and there's life after the baccalaureate, and still hope, so hang in there.
Yeah, absolutely. So,
yeah.
So Pati is inviting our guest into the studio. right now. And in the meantime, I just want to remind you that maybe like if you like our podcasts and if you have like a dime to spare, you could support us on Patreon. Like we're really doing this out of, I think we believe that this is it's like an important thing to have more discussion in the public space and put it more social science in the public space. I think it's really missing. And it was just nice to like maybe have at least some money to buy more coffee to get us working, or like beer since it's summer. So yeah, it would be nice if you could just support us on Patreon. And well, we're in Romania in Eastern Europe, so if you're like in a capital intensive country, that's like a tiny thing for you, big thing for us. So thank you.
So we talked mostly about the Romanian education. So our guest today is George Baca, who is a professor at Graduate School for International Studies, Dong-A University in South Korea. He teaches this semester a course on neoliberalism and Keynesianism entitled Preludes to Neoliberalism. Those are really hard words to say. And today we will be talking about education system and a lot of complicated words as such as neoliberalism. So welcome, George.
Thank you for having me.
And also like globalization.
Globalization,
one of the words you missed, Pati. I think it's a key word here.
Yeah. How did you come to start and research this kind of topic, and what kind of interesting things can you say or tell us about?
Okay, I took the job in at Dong-A University in 2010, and I did that. Part of the reason was to refocus my research on East Asia, and so I was generally interested in economic development and international political economy. And I was hired to run this global studies program at Dong-A University, which now no longer exists, but it did exist for about 5 years. And the way I came into education was I moved to Korea, and then I'd have these experiences that I thought were kind of strange, where I would be walking down the street on a Saturday morning to go have coffee, read the newspaper, and I would be just pushed off the side of the sidewalk by these groups of kids in school uniforms. And I was thinking, like, what are these kids doing in school uniforms and bustling around, on a Saturday morning? And then I would see them on Sunday. And then and then this one night, it was an evening. I was going to meet with a friend for dinner. And I had about an hour to wait. So in Korea, you can sit at one of these convenience stores, and they have these nice chairs outside, and you can drink a beer and just sit there. And I remember it was about 7:30 at night, and I was just relaxing. And I was even thinking, like, wow, this is really great living in Korea. Just sitting here, drinking a beer next to the beach and enjoying myself. And then all of a sudden, I saw this young girl. She must have been about 9 or 10, and she was walking very purposefully in a uniform, and it was like 7:30 at night, and she had a cup of coffee. And it was just like, oh my God, she's obviously, preparing herself to go through this gauntlet of education. And then I just became very intrigued by this. And then at the same time that I'm seeing, this complete frenzy about getting kids to study, almost 24/7, I noticed in my class that the students were totally uninterested in any of the topics we were talking about. They showed no interest in reading. They showed no interest in, and also it appeared to me that they didn't really know anything. Very, general, obvious things like the Depression, or, the international structure of the Bretton Woods or something like that, which is very interesting because South Korea was invented in that context. And so I was thinking, wait a second, they're going to school 24/7. Then my students, and by the way, my students were honor students. They had to be really competitive honor students to get into the program. And I was thinking, what is going on here? And rather than coming at it like their education system is, screwed up, I was trying to think like, okay, I need to try to figure out what the education system here is trying to do. And then the other interesting thing was, or still is to my mind, is if you meet a young Korean like your age, say in the early 20s, they're in the university or finished the university, you can guarantee that they've had at least 12 years of English education, at least. And then that includes going to English lessons at nighttime and Saturdays and half the day Sunday. And they have great anxiety just communicating. Like, for example, Korea is full of all these coffee shops. They've got Starbucks, but then they've got Korean versions of these coffee places. And you go in and you can get a really good coffee. You could get a cappuccino, an espresso, whatever. So you walk up and you see this young kid who's in 22 or something like that. And then you go, and as they see your face, they have this expression of just anxiety and like, oh my God, this foreigner, what am I going to do?
I have to socialize. Oh no.
And it's not socialize. It's just to speak English. It's like, oh my God, what do I do? And the funny thing is all we have to say is, I would like a cappuccino. Okay. That's about it. And so I started trying to figure out what was going on with this type of a situation. And so if there is great anxiety in just having a very small conversation, then expecting the students to read a text about, global economics or read one of the classics, like say Carl Polanyi or something like that.
It's just too much.
It's just totally. It's not even too much. It's just completely out of the realm of what is practical and logical. And so the first thing that I noticed is Korean students, and this goes all the way into their professional life, they have huge anxiety about passing this international test called the TOEIC test. So what turns out is that English education is completely structured around this test.
When do they have to pass this test?
That's a good question because it goes beyond taking the test one or two times. What has happened in Korea is they have used the test for this constant auditing of individual students' ability. So a student will often take the test at least once a year or sometimes even 2 to 3 times a year, and they use that to gauge their progress in English education. And so entrance into university and honors programs like the program that I was running, fellowships, and then at the end, once you've made it through university and graduate school, then jobs. So, for example, in Korea, on the job application, they have a little box to the right-hand corner for your TOEIC score.
Oh.
And so the thing about the TOEIC score or the TOEIC test, in what TOEIC refers to is a test for international English communication, and it was invented by a Japanese businessman in the 70s. And what he came up with is he was just a what we call a grifter. Donald Trump has made grifter a famous, these people that kind of are searching around for easy ways to make money. And so what he did is he saw in the 70s that the English education was a big thing in Japan, and he was trying to get into that. But as he got into it, there was kind of a crisis among Japanese elite because by the 70s, the Japanese economy had become so important once again, and they had this need for specialists, diplomats, business people to speak English well in order for international treaties or connections with different businesses. And so one of the problems was the Japanese elite felt that their diplomats and business people didn't speak English well enough. And so this guy came up with this idea, well, if we create a test we can make English measurable. And then if it's measurable, we can actually turn English into a tangible, what do you call it, a specialty or a tangible ability. So he had connections with very powerful people in Japan, and little by little he succeeded in convincing business people and government people to use this test. And then what happened is in 1982, there was this entrepreneur in Korea, and he had this English teaching company called YBM, which is a multinational corporation now. And it became and it's also traded internationally, and it became that way through the TOEIC. So what he did is he goes, oh my God, this is a brilliant idea. So what he did is he got the licensing for the TOEIC, and then he built his schools, which in Korean are called hagwons. And if you want to know anything about Korean society, it all goes down to these private academies called hagwons.
And you learn only English there?
The hagwons will teach you everything. Like for example, they have hagwons to take the entrance exams for jobs like to be a police officer, to work in the bureaucracy. You think of anything possible, and then there's a hagwon.
But these are private.
They're private.
They're like private schools trying to drill public school knowledge into students?
Exactly. That's exactly what they end up doing, because what these hagwons do is the whole idea is you are competing. Like, for example, the two of you here are friends, right? And then you're in the university, but you're actually competing with each other. So your mom is thinking like, oh, Patty's a sweet young lady, but she's going to beat you, what you need to do is go to this private academy, and then what they do is they drill you on the test materials. And they've got these for like you think of a subject and there's a hagwon for it in Korea, but the biggest focus is on math and then English, and English is by far the best. So if you're like walking down the street in a Korean city, you will see a building and it'll have like 8 or 9 levels, and they'll have like hairdressers, they'll have restaurants, and they'll always have a bunch of these hagwons, and the majority of them are English. So what happens is the students do not study to learn English, because, for example, if the student learned to speak English and communicate well and read books, the problem with that is it's not measurable. So they've got to get the measurement. So what happens is all of the hagwons, no matter what subject, they teach you to take multiple choice tests.
All of them are just multiple choice?
Yeah, because all of these international studies are basically multiple choice.
Oh, but even people who write tests know this is a bad testing design. Like you could do tests with better design.
Yeah, but the problem, the thing is the Koreans didn't invent this system. You have an international system, and based upon these multilateral institutions, and then these multilateral institutions, they tried to standardize economics, education, healthcare, everything. So within education, they create these international exams for science, for math, for English. And so what the Korean education system has done is it's become very instrumental in relationship to these exams. Now, the South Koreans are, like, if you look at each one of these international exams, math, science, English, they're always right at the top. But now there's often a problem because, like, for example, I recently had a student come to my office, and as a professor in Korea, you have to have these counseling sessions with your students. And the counseling sessions are very instrumental because the whole idea is to get students a job. The university and even the individual professor is awarded regarding how many jobs that the students get.
Oh.
Yeah. And it's not a major thing, but so the student comes into my office, and I have this little form on the university website. And then, I put in his name, or I pull up his name and everything, and then I just write a few things. So I just ask him, like, okay, what are your job prospects? Like, what have you done? Like, how have you prepared and everything? So I had this kid, and he could not communicate with me in English at all. And we ended up speaking in Korean And then finally, I was just dumbfounded. I was like, this is strange. This kid cannot speak English, and he's got serious anxiety about it. So I immediately, on his file, I just pulled up, and I wanted to see his TOEIC score. And TOEIC goes to 990, so 990 is a perfect. This guy had a 920 TOEIC, which means in the TOEIC measurement, that means he's fluent. So you, as an employer, you get his application, and you're like, wow, this is a fluent speaker. And so the thing is it's very well known now that it doesn't measure fluency at all, but it's become such a key aspect of the kind of the sorting out process for school, education, and jobs. So anyways, so you've got this huge industry. So now what's really interesting about this YBM Hagwon is by the early 90s, they had succeeded in convincing many of the big businesses to kind of accept TOEIC as a measuring device so that they could evaluate their employees or potential employees. And right at that moment, you had these new economic policies coming from the president at the time. His name is Kim Young-sam. And Kim Young-sam, he put through this economic liberalization policies, and he called those policies globalization. And so he says that we have this new world of international exchange, and Korea has to change with this new cosmopolitan world, and English education is the centerpiece of it. So with all of a sudden you have this new policy of globalization that restructured the legal economic structure in Korea, and then you have this guy who created this method for evaluating. So what happened as Korea expanded its English education at the time, then TOEIC became the measuring device, and universities structured their education. So every institution in Korea has structured their English education according to TOEIC. Now, after 2005 or 6, people understood that TOEIC does not actually measure fluency, but now it's become such a...
So now it's path dependency. They're on it.
Right. That's a good way to look at it. And so, and like I said, job applications have the little TOEIC score. And what's crazy is TOEIC is a commodity, and it was produced by a U.S. company called ETS. I think it's Educational Testing Services. So this Japanese entrepreneur met with them, and they negotiated a deal with him, but it required that the Japanese government was involved, and because the ETS is technically called a nonprofit, but they are a profitable company. But in order to keep their nonprofit status and their veneer of being an objective organization, they needed some kind of a connection with the Japanese government. So now we're left in a situation where where this has just become a very convenient way for educational institutions and employers to kind of choose candidates.
It's convenient, but it's not efficient, actually.
Yeah, it's not efficient if you think in terms of objectively learning English. But the research I'm doing is looks at the English educational system as not interested really in teaching English in an objective manner. But if you look at it in terms of a political mechanism, it's been very powerful, because what it has done is it's incorporated a couple generations of students in South Korea into this political economy that is draining the company, the Freudian slip, draining the country, but countries are basically companies.
Soon enough.
and so, it's an economic model that very well from Western Europe or the United States, where, GDP is growing, companies are profitable, but then actual jobs in the country are diminishing. So Korea is this exceedingly powerful economic power, yet at the same time, there is this widening gap between the rich and poor. And the thing is this educational system has been very important in legitimizing it or even naturalizing it. what's most important about the English education isn't what they learn in terms of English. They are disciplined in this way. And in the process, by having them go through this very seemingly rigorous, monotonous process, is they're creating these dispositions that make these young Koreans like accept the political economy as it exists, and then are competing madly to be involved in it. So politically, it's absolutely success. And that's basically my line of argument, is because every Anglo-European in the Korea, that teaches English, they say Korean English education is a failure. And it's like, well, it's a failure in terms of your ideal, but politically it's been an absolute success.
Yeah, but you mentioned earlier that you have like honorable students. So I was wondering, like, what do you have to do to become like an honorable student? Do you have to learn English and become competitive and do this kind of the game of the market?
Yeah. Well, so the program that I ran, what happened is it was open to Donga University students. So if you were in your freshman or sophomore year, you could compete to get into the program. And the program was quote, an honors program. So we would open up 40 spots every year, and we had from within the university more than 300 and sometimes close to 400 applicants. So it was highly, highly competitive. And the first competition occurred before I even showed up, because they created the institution and everything, and then they hired me, and then they brought me in as the founding faculty member, quote unquote. And so this competition is based upon all of these exams. So one of the most important exams besides the TOEIC is this thing called the Sunung, and the Sunung is the national university. It's kind of like the American SAT exam. So the students that came into the program, they had to have a high score in the Sunung, and then they had to have a good TOEIC score. And then when I got there, we added a couple dimensions. We had an interview, a face-to-face interview, and then one year I think we even did where I did a lecture for 20 minutes, and then the students were supposed to write a short 2-paragraph description of the...
You're adding more stress on their lives.
And that's exactly the thing that I came to is, because I came there from, the European kind of Enlightenment idea of education, and, it's all based on critical thinking and all of this stuff. And then after a few months there, or even a year or two, one of the things I noticed is I was kind of imposing this model on them that was only adding stress. But the other thing that it was doing that is very negative is it was creating a difficult situation for the students, because a critical thinking in the Western kind of Enlightenment tradition in the Korean context is rude behavior. Things are very hierarchical, and the professor or the teacher in Korea is presumed to kind of the all-knowing, omniscient, guardian of the young, youthful, person that needs to be guided.
So if you question the authority, you're just being rude.
Yeah, you're being rude. If you ask questions, you're being rude. And the other thing, for example, is the word in Korean for curiosity. It also means anxious and anxiety. So like to be,
God.
and so if you know somebody who's curious and they want to know more and everything, it's they've got kind of this anxiety because they're not comfortable. So you're stuck in this environment. So that's, I guess, the long way of going about how I came to English education. So when I first got there, I was studying political economy and history, and especially the Japanese occupation and colonialism. And then as I was developing this, more and more I started to see that English education had a really prominent role in the political structure and social hierarchy in Korea.
I find this to be like a very, very good argument that you can just see how it was efficient as a political tool. It just reminds me of one of the interviews when I was studying this Romanian Baccalaureate, which is the Romanian exam at the end of high school. I think at some point I asked some kind of question regarding liking school or something like that. But anyway, the person answered that, well, she doesn't really like school, but school is good for her because it prepares her and disciplines her for the market and the job to come.
Yeah, exactly. And that's exactly the view that Korean parents and Korean educators have. And that also leads me to another issue is Korea is quite an interesting case because within a very short period of time, they went from being one of the poorest countries in the world, and now they're one of the richest countries in the world, and politically quite potent. And we don't see that as much because it's very easy for us to just see South Korea as an American pawn. But the fact that they are industrialized, and once they became industrialized, which really started in the 60s and took hold seriously in the 70s, once a country is industrialized, then it can't be a pawn necessarily. I mean, it's clearly dependent upon the U.S., but it's an economic power that is quite significant in geopolitics. So things have changed very quickly, and one of the interesting places of this change is in terms of gender hierarchy, gender roles. And women have become highly educated over the past few decades. And like within my classes, much like here, the women are always much better than the men. And so in this change has been difficult in Korea because they have kind of this hierarchy based on, it's not like a Confucian society, but the dominant powers in Korea use these ideal views of Confucianism to kind of impose order. And one of the things that has happened with this rise of education since the fall of the dictatorship, because with the fall of the dictatorship, they just made education totally free market, is the rise of the importance of mothers in education. Well, actually, mothers have always been important, but in Korea, they refer to motherhood. One aspect of motherhood is educational managers. And so
it sounds horrible.
Yeah, and so it's horrible on one. Well, it is horrible. First of all, seeing education as something that you just manage as this instrumentality. But also the thing about it is managing someone's education in Korea is very complicated because the students will go to school till about 5 o'clock. Then after 5 o'clock, then you organize all of these different lessons in the private academies, and students will often go to school till 10, even at midnight. And the only reason why they don't go beyond that is because there's laws against it. So you have these mothers that have to coordinate, and especially if you have more than one child. And so, okay, at 6 o'clock, I have to get him over to the English education, for 2 hours. Then he comes home, eats quickly. Then he goes to the math, Hagwon. So women become viewed like the maternal role of a good Korean mom is to manage their son and daughter's education. And then part of this management is, and part of this
I just fell on my fell on my head.
Well, don't worry, it gets worse. And so part of this managing of education is doing research on finding the best Hagwons, the best Hagwon instructors, the best summer programs. Oh, I didn't mention they have these things called English camps. And English camps are for kids during winter and summer break. So they'll go to a camp, which will be, a lot of times they're at the university, and they will spend 5 hours a day English education at these camps. And so it just never stops. So the mother, her role is to find out the best places. And then what happens is mothers usually form some kind of a small group or clique, and they're very class-based. So say the three of us are mothers, and then there's this somebody we meet. Then what we do is we evaluate her. Is her class status, is her position of her son going to help our group, or is it going to drag us down? So these groups, they get together and they share information, and they find the best hagwons, and it's all hyper competitive.
Yeah, it's really interesting because you have this kind of hierarchical kind of structure in education, and you also have this in the mother manager that have to compete in the family.
Yeah,
to do this.
It goes in the private life in a very intimate way,
very personal.
Yeah. And the book that I'm writing has a chapter on this, and I'm also thinking about the mother as having kind of this, key role in the instrumental power of the state, because they're doing a lot of interesting work in terms of forming political dispositions. There's a whole raft of international structures that they're naturalizing. Now, to go back to the TOEIC test, the thing about the TOEIC test, as it was formed in Japan, it was formed as a English exam for business. So when you're studying the TOEIC, you're also studying business. And so the multilateral world of the IMF, the World Bank, the OECD is kind of the assumed structure. And then this assumed structure is based upon multinational corporations. So you're getting an English education that is teaching you this.
Based on markets. Like it's not the typical when we encounter languages, it's usually the literature thing. We go through their like classics or something.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's how I tried to structure my classes, is introduce the classics or introduce important historical texts or something like that. And the students are completely lost because what they're used to is this kind of regimented exam system. So another aspect of it is I was dumbfounded when I noticed that students would come to my class with no notebook or pen.
A laptop or nothing?
Nothing, really.
Nothing.
Yeah, or maybe a pen, but definitely never a notebook. And I thought this was very strange because in my learning, which continues today, I use notebooks. So if you go to my house or my office or something, there's just these piles of notebooks that are scribbled all over. And, that's a very important part of learning for me. If for example, if I meet somebody on the street and they tell me their name, I won't remember it unless I write the name down. So
but how do they do it?
So maybe this is a really old-fashioned way of learning, but so these students come into my class and I was really blown away by it. And also, I came from the U.S., and in the U.S. we have a racist view of education, and so the traditional racial view is that the white people are smart and darker people are not as smart. But then the Asians came to the U.S. in these large amounts in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Koreans and Chinese. And they, kicked butt in the classroom. So the American racial view, it's kind of like, okay, we're the smart ones, but the Asians are smarter than us. And so in the United States, you just have this idea, I'm going to Korea. I'm going to be teaching in an honors program. They're like, wow, those students are going to be so incredible. And then I get there and, they don't read, they don't like to speak, and they don't have notebooks, and they're not prepared for the class. And I'm thinking, like, what's going on? Part of it is all of their education, including continuing on into the university, is based upon these textbooks. And within the textbooks, they always have these little spaces to write in. So whatever writing they do is in the textbook, and it's about basically repeating whatever is said, as opposed to, the way I like to think of learning is, you put something out there and then you interpret it. And through your interpretation, you have to defend your position with evidence and stuff like that. So that's just a totally different world in Korea.
There's something that I'm not sure I understood. These tests, and they pay to take them?
Yes. Yes, so that's the funny thing is because also Korea there is very nationalist, and they have a racial nationalism that came to them through Japan, or came to them through the Prussian nationalism by way of Japan, and so so they have this very nationalist disposition, but then their education system is centered on these exams, which are commodities being created by U.S. companies. And, I've tried to point that contradiction out. Now, within the Korean context, there is this big issue, kind of like Romania, but to a larger degree, about the issue of corruption and cheating and all nepotism and all of these different things. So what Koreans have done is they've come to the idea that these exams are the most objective way to kind of make decisions and sorting people out, to become members of the middle class. So if you go to a Korean bookstore, for example, we all like bookstores. Well, you won't like a Korean bookstore because all they are is study manuals. And study manuals are part of the big political economy. So you've got these companies that produce all of these just study manuals. And so most of my students in Korea have never actually just read a book.
Where is the literature? Where is it? Where do they put it?
No, they do have bookstores that have literature. Like they do have this national bookstore called Kyobo, and it's kind of like there used to be a Barnes and Nobles that used to be very big in the U.S. before Amazon, but they have Kyobo, and you can walk in there, and they have like something that is like really popular in the U.S. Say this crap from like someone like Jordan Peterson or something like that. Michael Sandel was huge in Korea. So then they become translated into Korean. And so your kind of middle class bourgeois types will go in and buy these books. But for example, where my office is, there's this like alley, and it's like called the Book Alley. And it's got all these like little shops right next to each other. And I would say 75% of them are all manual. There's a couple small shops that have literature and these different books, but most of the time, the biggest part of the book market is these study manuals.
Aside from the educational tests that you have to pay for, and I'm assuming that you have to pay for the summer camps and the private tutoring and stuff like that, how would because I'm coming from a proletarian kind of family, I'm thinking if I'm from a working class kind of family, how would I survive? Because there are a lot of money spending there in education.
You probably would not do very well, and that's the reality of the situation in Korea. So there are debates in Korea about this, because it's very clear that to succeed in this environment, you have to have lots of money, but it's also creating a major problem in the household. So, for example, household debt in Korea is rising. It's just going out of this stratosphere. And a lot of it is for funding of this education. And then you've got people that are doing things like taking money out of their retirement accounts to pay for their children's education. And so it's a huge problem. And then the other thing, everything I'm talking about, from the hagwons to study manuals to tutoring and everything, it's hierarchical. So you have the expensive hagwons that the rich kids go to, and they have a better track record of getting these kids into the big universities. And then you have these lower level that the working class will go to that are just little more than babysitters. And when I'm talking about because the book that I'm writing on Korea, it's focusing on the politics of this, growing economic disparity. And you can see the disparity most clearly through the educational structure. And the both of you have these totally distraught looks on your face right now,
Yes.
which I want to say are totally appropriate. And you know, the funny thing is before I came to Korea, I wrote this book called Conjuring Crisis, and it's on post-civil rights racial politics, and it was a very disturbing take on the kind of racism that has grown through civil rights institutions. Because the whole idea was like, okay, we passed the civil rights, we have these new institutions that are going to guide the nation to, you know, its high status of being the best nation in the world and all this type of stuff. But it was a very disturbing book. And a couple of friends of mine, I was back in the U.S. visiting them, and you know, because some people are just like, "You're studying education. What's going on with that?" Because it sounds kind of lame. And what I've said is, I said, "Look, this book on Korean education is going to be so much more disturbing than the book on racial oppression, and the education system is just very disturbing, and I find myself in this very awkward position now, because one of the ironies, life in Korea right now is very difficult, and these poor Korean kids are struggling. And by the way, things like suicide, child suicide, are just off the charts. In the OECD, Korea is the leader in child suicide, unhappiness, all of these different things. It's really a difficult situation. And then I get frustrated with my students in my class because they can't do kind of these very basic things that I want them to do, and I've pared things down for them. But then I'm thinking like, okay, these poor kids have so much stress and anxiety as it is, and most of them are going to have a horrible time finding a reasonable job. But the irony is, I'm living in Korea as a professor, a tenured professor, a full professor, and all that good stuff. And my lifestyle in my standard of living is so much higher than it ever was in the U.S. And at this point, like, there's no way I could ever go back to the U.S. because more important than the salary are things like health care. I have a heart problem, so health care is kind of important. I go back to the States, I can't get insurance because I have a pre-existing condition. And so I have a very cheerful, carefree life in Korea, and it's a very ironic situation, because here I'm having this kind of easiest life I've ever faced in Korea, while all of these people I'm facing are struggling, and their future is pretty grim. And what I found the most ironic is I seem to be more worried about it than they are. And so it's
because you can see it better, I think.
Yeah, I can see it better, and then one way that I see it is from just my personal life. I feel very grateful for the life that I have. I'm 52 years old, and so I look back the last 30 years of my life, and I just think like, wow, you know, I did a lot of things. I traveled. I've seen a lot of the world. I've got this profession that is almost like a hobby. You know, when I'm researching a book, if I wasn't employed, I would probably be reading most of the same stuff. So I'm just thinking like, how did this work out for me? But the thing that I realize is that at 52, that, you know, I'm not saying I'm going to die soon, but I've got 25 more years before I'm in my late 70s, and I look at them and I just see that this idea of traveling, learning just for the sake of learning, experiencing things is just so far out of their purview. And, you know, and I just feel very sad for them, because, you know, this life, because one of the things that Korean students have been taught is that you go to school to get a job. And then when you see them in their junior, senior year, they have this anxiety of getting a job. And oftentimes they'll take any job, especially if it's got long-term benefits. And they don't take into account that job, going to the office at 8 o'clock in the morning, and then in Korea, you actually have to stay after hours, and then you have to do this mandatory socializing, which involves drinking, and it's not fun at all. And the thing is I've told these students, it's like, keep in mind, when you get this job, you'll be happy for one moment, but then within a week or two or a month or maybe a year, you're going to probably hate the job. And that hatred for that job is going to exponentially grow. It's like, and but that kind of viewpoint is just, and it is very difficult because, look, these kids, they know that their parents have this huge mountain of household debt because of their education, and so it's just a highly depressing situation. And the political economy of Korea right now, they've exported all of manufacturing, so there is not the economic structure to absorb these highly educated. So right now, I read an article just the other day that Korea's biggest export right now is highly educated, unemployed people. And so it's just it's a recipe for political disaster.
I don't know if there is happy research. I'm wondering at some point if like how much of research is actually maybe joyful, because I feel so many of the subjects are depressing.
Yeah, and one of the things I've noticed is as I've gotten into the education, especially English education, is there's a ton, 90% of the research on English education, English as a second language, it's not critical at all. And the criticism is we need to improve our ability to teach these these kids and everything like that. And it's very depressing in itself, because rather than analyzing the politics of this education system, it's kind of legitimizing a natural, and it's doing it through reform. We can reform this, we can improve this, the situation is quite dire, but it's very reminiscent of what's going on in Europe. The only difference is Korea doesn't have, Eastern Europe attached to it where it can draw cheap labor. Instead it has the Philippines and even now Africa and the Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand, flood of cheap labor coming in, and they use the cheap labor and then they call it multiculturalism.
I wanted to ask you, maybe, you already said this a little bit, but what do you think is best for you to do as a teacher in this position?
Yeah, I to be honest, I don't know. I really don't know what to do. Because one of the problems with the way that I teach is that I'm pretty passionate about what I do, and I don't come into a class with this idea of what you need to learn. I'm more kind of thinking through things, and I kind of want this interest in learning and thinking critically to be kind of contagious. And in Korea, it's not. And so the more committed I am to teaching and to trying to do something that is positive, the more the students dislike me. And so, and then I'm audited just like everybody else in these education structures. And so what I have found is the more apathetic that I am, the better it is for me just to get by on a daily existence. But what I do have is every once in a while, I always have a couple students that kind of grab onto what I'm doing, and then and I've worked with them. Like, for example, I've had several students that I've worked with, and I've got them full fellowships at CEU in Budapest. Oh. Yeah, and then just the other day, I got the student into, I didn't get him, but I worked with him to get into.
You feel proud.
Yeah, and then like for the CEU students, I did a lot in terms of explaining to them how this process works, that you have to write a good letter of introduction. You have to state your case, why you should be in CEU, and then you have to write a writing sample. And I did all of those things, but in the end, the success of the students came from that they actually did it. But for the most part, what I'm saying to them is just it's just a bunch of noise, And because there's this old saying in the U.S., it's actually, well, it's probably not just an African American saying, but I learned it from a wise African American man, and actually there's a famous song that uses a line, and it goes something like, "Why didn't you tell me?" And he goes, "I would have told you, but you wouldn't have heard it."
Wow.
And so, and we've all had these experiences, I think, where somebody could say something to you, but you're just not in the place to actually understand it. And there's part of that with my students, but there's also the part of what I'm saying is, I think, in terms of their practical day-to-day business, is totally irrelevant. Because, the majority of these kids or young adults, they need a job. And, what I'm teaching them is probably not going to help them get a job. And the model of thinking critically, reading carefully, doesn't really hold water. And so I don't know really what to do, because the other thing is, how am I going to fix the situation? And then, does it really need fixing? Because the political economic structure is functioning in a specific way, and and it's based upon a view of education that has done its job. So I definitely can't fix the job, fix anything, and I just continue reading and writing and thinking and enjoying myself. And
it's good if you can find
some balance,
strength to do that.
Yeah, it doesn't take strength. It just takes cynicism and apathy.
Doing great.
Yeah, and I'm not naturally cynical or apathetic, but the
tough life made you.
But the thing is it's not a tough life.
It's the good life.
It's a the life I have in Korea is not tough at all. It's very, like I said, one of the things in Korea, professors are viewed, it's a very high status position, and there's like social respect. I don't necessarily get a lot of that social respect, because being, a foreigner, being a white person, being an American, you have this kind of odd status. But I do have the same job as a high status Korean with the same benefits and everything like that. And so I live very comfortably, and Korea is a very interesting part of the world to live in, where traveling is great. And so, yeah, and then the thing about Korea is it's infinitely interesting intellectually, and, that's my trade. I'm a scholar, so, I'm pretty happy in that sense. But, yeah, I feel sad that, but I'm basically part of a system that is creating this education that's, highly problematic. But but I was also part of an education system in the United States that was highly problematic too.
So there's difficult to get out.
Yeah, there's no way out. Unless there is some kind of a revolution or something like that. But
hopefully.
Hopefully.
I remember an example from my life. I mean, the Korean education system is really particular, and this kind of competitiveness. So I remember when I was in 8th grade, there's this thing where you have to pass your exams to go to a better high school. And of course, it doesn't compare with the Korean experience. But I was talking to Maria, and I said that I used to watch like a lot of Korean soap operas, and watch a lot of, I'm sorry, and read a lot of mangas and manhwas. So for me, I was going through a lot of stressful situations. So getting this kind of like short glimpse of that kind of experience, I could somehow relate on that, being stressed and being like the kid that has to compete in such a high task or whatever. And I was always like the weird kid and I had always struggled with. I was an edgy adolescent, but I was struggling with being the weird kid because I always tried to question my kind of teachers and stuff like that and my colleagues, and they were always like, no, that's what the teacher said, so we have to do it. And I was struggling in that kind of stressful situation, and I could relate somehow, not the full experience, of course.
Yeah, no, I think we can all relate to it. My education was quite different because I grew up in a family where nobody went to college, and it wasn't really expected that you would go to college. And so in high school, my brothers and my sister and I, we never did what we were supposed to. Because this whole idea of homework was totally foreign to us. Our parents wanted us to do better in school, but they didn't know how because they had never been to college or anything like that. And so I remember, like, our report cards would come back, and they were always the same. They were always bad, and my parents were always angry, and they would yell at us. But then that would be it. And so also in the U.S., there's kind of this, if you grow up working class, and especially if you're a young boy trying to become macho and all that stuff, you're encouraged to be kind of anti-authority, and I still am, but I was always very anti-authority in class. And so when I was of age to go to college, I didn't have any of the credentials necessary. So my GPA, my grade point average was way too low. I didn't even take the SAT because, why? It's just going to be a disaster. And then, I went through the circuitous path of the system in the U.S. that they call junior colleges. So I was working, I was a union worker. I was a warehouseman. And then I was going to this junior college at nighttime or whenever. And through that process, you get your basic prerequisites to get into a university, and you end up not really taking tests. But then all of a sudden, 5 years later, I become this, motivated person that wants to become an academic, and then you have to take the GRE. And I was like, oh my God. Because by that time, I'd gone through university dodging the test, and I was able to dodge one. And then all of a sudden you come up to the university and you have to take the GRE, and, it was stress inducing, and, and I didn't do that well, but I did high enough to where they have kind of this cutoff point. Like it was something like you have to get at least a minimum 1,000 points to where your application will be accepted. And I got like 1,100. But what was very funny at that time, through my education, was like becoming a college student in junior college coincided with my activity as a labor union kind of activist, and through labor union activism, I was introduced to Marxism, and there was a communist group, and so for me, Marxism, socialism kind of intersected with my education, and they were wrapped up together in a way where you couldn't really disentangle. So I had the GRE test, and I took the test on my own. I didn't go and get advice, but I just took the test, and then you take the practice test, and then you check. And like what was so funny is in the U.S., the anti-communism is so strong. There was this one question said, what is a revolutionary? And the right answer was like a turncoat, somebody who is disloyal. And, and my answer was like a more positive. and right there, it just showed me, like, I was like, what? How could I get that wrong? Or another example that I teach my students is like Europe is not really a continent. Europe is basically a peninsula on the Asian continent. That's what look at a map, that's what it is. But if you teach that to a student that, hey, this is all, bullshit, it's European propaganda, they'll get that wrong on a standardized test. But these standardized tests, they're anxiety producing, but then the anxiety pushes you into this kind of framework, and that's what I'm interested in, is it creates these dispositions. So in the U.S. system, it's designed to teach you that being a revolutionary or somebody seeking change is a disloyal, dishonest thing. Powerful.
Yes, indeed. Well, thank you for the discussion. It was really interesting.
My pleasure.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it will be really good to have this discussion out right now when there's this high stakes testing going on in Romania.
Yeah, no, in the high stakes testing is part of this, like I said, this international order, which is inserting these large parts of the globe into a very specific political and economic structure, and it's all organized by these multilateral institutions, and it's now that is very depressing. There's almost no way out of that.
On that note,
like I said, it can only get worse.
Thank you for listening to Contrasense. Today's guest was George Baca. This week's episode was produced by Maria and Pati. Soundtrack by Kind Studios. Recorded at Radio EBS. This podcast is partly supported by the Faculty of Sociology and Social Work from the University of Babeș-Bolyai in Cluj-Napoca. If you like the episode, you can support us by donating to our Patreon. You'll find the link below. More about us on our Facebook page, and you can listen to us on SoundCloud, YouTube, iTunes, and Spotify. We're looking forward to your feedback. You can send us emails, and see you next time. Hear you. You hear us.
Hear you.